Hi everyone, welcome back to the second part of our video on American literature between 1865 and 1914. Before we start our second video, I just want to do a quick recap of what we talked about in the first video. So if you haven't seen the first video, I strongly recommend that you go back and watch that first video before continuing this present one. In the first video, we started talking about the effects of the American Civil War and, of course, the Reconstruction era that quickly followed it. We also talked about the multifaceted series of changes that American people experienced in their daily lives in that period. In particular, we talked about the industrialization of America as well as the rapid urbanization, which was like visible everywhere. The expansion of the railroad system completely changed the way American people felt connected to other parts of the country. And all of these social changes had an impact on the literary marketplace of America in that era. We also talked about what American writers tried to do in this period, which was quite different from what the romantic idealists of the previous era were doing. And so these writers actually believed that it is their duty to show the world around them, and that's why we have the birth of a movement, of a literary movement that we called realism. So we talked about realism as well. We talked about realism in America as well. And now we are ready to continue talking about some of the most important issues which were raised in this period. And then the second literary movement, which came out of realism itself, called naturalism. So, just without further ado, let's continue our analysis of American literature 1865 to 1914. The next important issue that we have to discuss in relation to this period is, of course, about the role of women. There is a phrase that like almost everyone unanimously uses to address this issue, and it's the woman question. Now, there was a lot of debate about the role of women in American life. There has always been one, but in particular, we had this question raised again and again by so many different people in this specific period in the post Civil War era, mostly because uh, females, especially those raised in middle class families or professional class families and homes, had increasing access to secondary or even higher education. And so we had the rise of literacy among men, and these women actually demanded, they had certain demands that had to be met, and they wanted to participate in, for example, social discussions. They wanted to attend book clubs. Yeah, they wanted to be an important part of the society. They were also avid readers of literature, and so part of the reason why we have so many periodicals and magazines in this period is actually because there were a lot of women who were actually very, very interested in reading works of literature in this period. And that's why they also really, really wanted to be represented in works of literature, but also they wanted publishers to publish magazines and periodicals more often so that they could, pass the time reading those. But let me just like very quickly emphasize the fact that they were not passive consumers of literature. They wanted to be active. They engaged in all kinds of cultural and political activities in the late 19th century. And so, in a way, they were trying to seek opportunities to assert their own wants and desires. They participated social clubs of all kinds. They helped arrange so many different movements uh, in the United States, and so that's why we say that the woman question became increasingly a hot topic, an increasingly hot topic in this era. But the woman question was not just about like who a woman is or what she can do in the society. Everything related to women, including their education, their participation in the workforce, the social influence that they wanted to exert on the society. All of these issues were discussed in a debate called the woman question. We can probably or safely argue that the most important issue that they were really concerned with was suffrage, or having the right to vote. Now, of course, in 1870, we had the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, which extended voting rights to African American men as well. But it was interesting that even when African American men were given the right to vote, still no woman of any race, African American or white, had the right to vote. And so, this quest to finally ratify another amendment in the US Constitution, which would extend voting rights to women, continued until 1920, when finally the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution was ratified, and now women could actually vote. This was an important step for women because it helped them on their journey of gaining autonomy and, of course, self sufficiency. Now, we have so many different writers who discussed this. Actually, excerpt here is from the Norton Anthology, which I have like copied and pasted exactly as it appears in the book. But the portrayals of women in literature were also quite diverse. Well, because we had different kinds of women in society. So we have we portrayals of, for example, uh, of an American girl, so to speak, who is new to a world of leisure and desire. And so this was the kind of image that we can see in Henry James, especially with the publication of his famous book, Daisy Miller. But we also have, for example, other writers who address uh, the situation of women in the society. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper is a perfect example of showing how, for example, different kinds of institutions and oppressive regimes in the late 19th century were actually trying to dominate the world of women, and so kind of oppress them even more. And so we have all of these examples here. We have books by Theodore Dreiser, which discuss, for example, female protagonists who wish to achieve some kind of autonomy and fulfill their desires, with, of course, different outcomes. Some of them finally getting what they want, and some of them just failing because of like outside forces. And so we have all of these writers who, each in their own turn, portrayed American women from a specific perspective. So the woman question in society was such an influential topic that it actually found its way into American literature. And so, as we have been talking, issues of race and gender became increasingly important in this age. American writers actually realized that these are some of the important issues that cannot be overlooked, and so they were already concerned with issues of race, and now the issue of gender was also, really debated at the time, and so different kinds of writers talked about these two issues simultaneously. But what is important is that all of these authors kind of realize that writing can have like a therapeutic effect for the society. So writing had a very, very essential function to play in helping Americans understand and explore, of course, these complex problems. So that's why we have so many writings, so many examples of writing on these topics. The other issue that we want to talk about is that American people kind of felt that in this era that their society was shaped or was being shaped by forces that they could not see. Now, we are going to talk about some of these forces under the heading of unseen forces. But basically, let me just tell you what we mean by this. The American society knew that they had freedom to do whatever they liked, and so they had like the kind of freedom to choose what kind of government they wanted. They had the freedom to choose what kind of life they wanted to conduct, but they were also increasingly worried of certain institutions or places or companies that really didn't follow the rules. And so they were really worried that there would be some kind of entity in the society that does not play by the rules, and so therefore it might disrupt the society. So they had some kind of valid concern about what forces are at play in their society. And so, as I said, they were really worried. Now, the industrialization of the United States was one of those, important issues that happened, one of those important developments that happened in the late 19th century. And now more and more people realize that this kind of laissez-faire capitalism, which encourages the establishment of different kinds of corporations, big corporations, has actually led to a negative outcome like for the whole society, because now we have these large corporations which do not really seem to obey the law, and so they can do whatever they like, which is a problem that America even faces today, especially when it comes to the fact that big corporations like Amazon and other big corporations actually play by their own rules. They don't pay any taxes because they have found some kind of loopholes in the tax codes that allows them to evade paying taxes, to avoid paying taxes. And so, American people were actually worried about it, but not all forces were negative. Let's just say that. We had, for example, the forces of science at play in this age. So we had, for example, like engineers and scientists who brought so many different kinds of innovations to American life. So engineers were in charge of like bringing electricity to different kinds of houses, different kinds of energies to people's houses, and so there were things that American people had never seen before. Scientists, on the other hand, had so many discoveries, just which made it difficult for American people to keep up with. And so, as we said, like the expansion of the telecommunications networks, or, for example, different kinds of scientific improvements, which would allow Americans to enjoy science and have a better life, were also some of those forces that shaped American life. So, just to summarize, we can say that like there were so many different forces at play which had effects and impact on the American life, and sometimes there were so many like at the same time that American people just didn't know what was going on. Another force which kind of changed how many Americans understood their own lives, and of course, all of those social issues in their society, was of course the theory of evolution, which was proposed by Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin emphasized in his influential books, The Origin of Species and, of course, The Descent of Man, that human beings had actually developed from other non human forms of life. And because they were successful in adapting to the environment, the changing conditions of the environment. Now, Darwin himself was a naturalist who was not really interested in arguing that, okay, the same thing is happening in the society now, and people are actually engaging in different kinds of fights and competitions to survive. But it was an English philosopher called Herbert Spencer who was also influenced by this idea. Now, Spencer actually understood that this idea of always fighting, and then the issue of survival, especially when it comes to fighting with other people to get your hands on the last available resources is actually what has always been around. And so he coined the phrase the survival of the fittest. And this phrase was used to describe how people are like fighting or always in a struggle because we are trying to survive. And so all of these competitions that we have between people in the same country and all of these wars that we have between different countries can be explained through this theory of survival of the fittest. And this theory became so popular uh, that even Darwin, who had initially rejected it, it actually forced Darwin to include it in a second version of his own book, The Origin of Species. So American people were, looking for answers everywhere, and people like Darwin and Spencer try to provide them with some answers. And so Darwinism, in this like advanced form of it, which also included Spencer's survival of the fittest, could actually explain why there was so much violence in the society. But at the same time, people used it to justify like every kind of violence. And so they used it as a justification, as a blanket like justification to argue that, yeah, it's only natural for us to have xenophobia, to hate foreigners. It's only natural for us to hate, for example, Asian Americans. It's only natural for us to prohibit immigrants from China, and then even put it and then pass a law in Congress called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 because they are not fit to be in our country, because we are fit and we want to survive. And so we don't need those quote unquote unfit people to be in our country. And so uh, people misused these theories, and so they justified violence against immigrants and all of those native Indians. And they were simply saying that, it's just the survival of the fittest and there's nothing we can do about it. Among other issues that we have to discuss, as I promised in the first video, is of course, okay, now that there was so much violence going on, well, how was this violence portrayed in the literature of the period? There was a movement which came directly from realism, but sort of changed some of the tenets of realism. And it was through this literary uh, school that American writers or writers in general all over the world could actually portray all of this violence and struggle in the human society. And the name of this school was, of course, naturalism. So, naturalism is actually, I will talk about it later in greater details, but naturalists were just like modernists. They wanted to focus on the lower classes of people and they wanted to show their suffering and pain. However, naturalists believed that, realists were actually, very polite, and the world around them is not polite. So they were accusing realists of not really dealing with those ugly issues that plague, human societies. And so they were saying that our modern world is ruthless, it is bloody, violent, and aggressive, and we have to talk about these issues. Yes, realism was also dealing with the conditions of poor people, lower classes, and their suffering and pain, but still, it was just kind of like an acceptable version of it, right? Because they were saying, okay, we don't want to talk about all of these terrible things. We don't want to talk about things which are too violent because we don't want to scare the readers. But naturalists were saying that this is unacceptable. If you want to tell the truth about the pain and suffering of some groups of people, you have to talk about it, even if it is ugly, even if it is really bloody and violent. That's why naturalists, focus on portraying even the outcasts, the social pariahs of the society. Now, realism talks about poor people, But in realistic works, you usually do not find like those people who belong to the fringes of the society. Like, for example, I don't know, child molesters, or for example, prostitutes. And so, naturalism was saying that, okay, well, we have to talk about these people too, because they also belong to the society. Now, there's another difference between realism and naturalism, which I will talk about later, and it's the concept of agency. You know, in realism, people still have agency. Like you can do something to change your conditions, whereas in naturalism, there's a kind of like determinism going on, and so they were saying that well, human beings are miserable. They're going to experience misery. They're going to experience you know, a terrible life full of pain and suffering. And all of this, and there is no agency, like people cannot really do anything about it because of determinism. You know, sort of like kind of a biological determinism called heredity, and then a social determinism, which is the result of living in a sordid environment that actually force these people to continue suffering until they die, for example. So this is also another difference between realism and naturalism. However, I will talk about this like later on that there was not absolute determinism among you know, naturalists. So this kind of determinism that they talk about is not an absolute deterministic uh, an absolutely deterministic view of the world. They do this because of some specific agenda that they have, and I will talk about this later on, just in a few minutes, I mean. Anyway, so let's dive into naturalism a little more. So, like realism, naturalism has, you know, two different definitions, like a general definition and a specific definition. So, the general definition of realism and naturalism is just a style of writing that can be used by all kinds of writers. Like even contemporary people, contemporary writers right now can talk about, can write a work which could be considered realistic or naturalistic. However, both of these movements, realism and naturalism, have a specific definition as well, which you know is it just goes back to the 19th century. So the specific definition of naturalism is that it was a movement in art and literature at the end of the 19th century, and it was an offspring of realism. They have a lot of similarities. In fact, some people go even further and argue that you know we shouldn't even call it naturalism. We just have to call it extreme realism. So another name for naturalism is extreme realism. Now, the principles and objectives of this kind of literature was, of course, they were first outlined by the famous French writer Émile Zola. Now, naturalists believe that, you know, we are just like scientists in the, you know, just like scientists in the field of like natural sciences who study objects in nature as objectively as possible. We writers must also focus on the objective reality. Now, the objective observation, which was important in realism, is also important in naturalism, but there is a tiny difference between them. The naturalistic writer observes reality, but also tries to design like little experiments for the characters to see how they react in a specific situation. So they put the characters, so to speak, uh, in a framework, in an experiment, so that because they want to see how the determinism of this situation will influence the character's behavior and so will lead the character to an almost predetermined outcome. And the result, as I said, is usually death and even more suffering. These writers are actually interested in analyzing the consequences of human behavior and emotion. You know, if you really want to like understand what naturalism is, you can actually take a look at this book, A Handbook of Literature, uh, edited by Harman and Holman. You know, there's a very nice definition of naturalism in this work that I would like to talk about. They argue that, you know, for naturalists, because they think of themselves as natural scientists who have to design experiments so that they can put characters in those experiments to see how they react. Every character or event like is not really important in itself. It's only important because it represents a law of nature, a fundamental law of nature, like gravity, for example. Okay, I'm just saying that as an example. So they create characters and they create experiments so that these characters in these specific situations can prove a fundamental law of nature. And so naturalism, in a way, is the application of the principles of scientific determinism to fiction and drama. Let's take a look at this interesting example. Like, let's see how a realist writer would describe this scene and how a naturalistic writer, a naturalist, would describe it. So imagine you are given a block of wood, okay, just a piece of wood, which is being forced, which is being pushed by a force, and this force is creating a kind of acceleration or speed in this block of wood. A realist will try to concentrate its attention on the accurate description of that wood, like what is the size of the wood and like what color is it, what color it is, and everything related to an accurate description of it, like what's the speed exactly, something like this. Now, for naturalism, however, the tendency is a little bit different. A naturalist will tend to see in this operation a clue that there is a scientific law which can explain why this kind of push, this kind of force can produce this kind of speed, right? And so a naturalist writer will be interested in finding out the relationship between the force, the block, and of course the final acceleration. And so it will finally come to the it will all come down to this, that the naturalist will finally say that, okay, well, this scene here represents Newton's second law of motion, right? Or even like even including the equation here in his analysis of it or in her analysis of it, that finally this scene here proves Newton's second law of motion. Now, of course, this example is not a literary example, but I just wanted to show you how different writers see the same thing differently, see the same scene differently. So, naturalists also wanted, if you remember, we said that realists wanted to broaden the scope of the audiences. Naturalists also try to expand the scope of literary topics and subjects. So, whereas realists actually want to show poverty and the suffering of the lower classes, naturalists argue that we have to choose characters from lower classes but focus on other predicaments of the society as well, like violence and corruption and prostitution. And so naturalists all argue that whenever you choose characters, you have to talk about it in even more details when you're describing places, characters, or even events. So that's why as I told you a few seconds ago, naturalism is sometimes called extreme realism. So just to take the analogy a step further, if we considered realists as photographers who want to capture a scene with as many details as possible, naturalists are actually brutal photographers. They represent ugly and disgusting sides of human life as meticulously as possible. Now, I told you that the principles of naturalism were actually outlined first by Émile Zola. There are two books in which you can find these principles: the experimental novel and other essays, as well as naturalism in the theater. Now, in these two books, Émile Zola talks about the fact that characters' motivations and their behaviors, generally speaking, are determined by heredity and the environment. So it is the duty of the writer to act like a zoologist and then, or like a biologist in a lab, so that he can put the characters in different situations, in different, for example, scenarios, and see how this determinism will lead them toward their inevitable death. So naturalists, just to put it in a nutshell, believed in determinism, a kind of biological determinism, exemplified in the term heredity, and of course, social and economic forces as well. And so they believe that everything, family, social class, everything determines a person's thoughts and behavior. As I told you, like there's another difference between realism and naturalism. In realism, people live in poverty, but they may be able to change their conditions if they set their hearts and minds to it. However, for naturalists, people are extremely passive, not active agents. And so people are not agents who cause actions, events and actions befall people, according to naturalists. However, as I told you, naturalists do not really believe in absolute determinism. They actually want to control nature and redirect it. Now, if they don't believe in absolute determinism, why on earth are they talking about all of these ugly sides, and why on earth are they telling us that, everyone is just determined either by heredity or by the environment? Writers actually are looking for something else in the society. So they want to shine light on, the humiliation of people and their basic needs, but they also want to do something else. They don't just want to focus on the ugliness of human beings. Naturalists are like investigators who want to investigate the society's ills and dark aspects. As I told you, they believe that realism is just too polite. These writers are like social scientists. They are like a pathologist who performs an autopsy on the dead body of the society to find out why this society is dead. And so there is a glimmer of hope in naturalism, because yes, they do portray the dark side of people as well as the society, but ultimately what they're interested in is encouraging people to build a more humane society, and so that's why we call them progressives. They actually want to see progress in the society because they believe that we can build a better society. But there is a prerequisite for this. There is a condition for this. You cannot build a better society if you just close your eyes and ignore the ills of the society. So, first, you have to objectively describe the ills and the predicaments of the current society so that you can ultimately build a better one. Okay? So I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but in naturalism, there are all kinds of conflicts. Man versus nature uh, is the dominant one. If you're looking for an example, To Build a Fire by Jack London is a perfect example of this. Man versus himself is also important, an important part of it when you are fighting with yourself, you are fighting with your heredity, with the qualities that you have actually inherited from your parents. And as I said, just like realism, the setting is the contemporary world, not some kind of glorified past or imaginary future. So, what are some of the common themes of naturalism in literature? Okay, let's talk about this. The first one is the difficulties of survival. So, again, just like the story of To Build a Fire, which is a perfect story, survival is usually synonymous with pain and suffering, and these stories usually portray this kind of suffering. We also care about the animalistic side of people because we know that people usually follow their animalistic desires, greed, sex, domination. These are some of the common themes which are present in naturalistic short stories or novels or literature in general. We have biological determinism, we have the impact of heredity and the environment, and of course, the inability of most people to exercise their free will in the world. We have so many different writers. I'm sure you already know most of them, but these are some of the writers that we will talk about in the following sessions. So we have Stephen Crane, Jack London, Frank Norris, Theodore Dreiser, and of course, Upton Sinclair. These are the famous writers. Now, so this is all you need to know about naturalism. Now, the next stage is, of course, talking about this new American country, which established himself in the form of an imperial power, as we discussed in the first video. Now, after after this process of reconstruction was completed, we have the American people looking elsewhere for expansion, as we said. So we discussed this in the first video as well, and we said that America was wanted to establish itself as a world superpower, as an imperial power. So when the process of building a U.S. empire in North America was done, Americans now looked abroad to expand their country. And so it is in this age that, America, United States goes to war with with so many different countries, with Spain specifically in 1898. So this kind of war is usually said to be an important step in establishing America as a country with just wants war with other countries because they now want to dominate the whole world and not just, for example, the region of North America. We also have, for example, wars in Cuba and so many other countries as well. And step by step, America wants to turn itself into an empire, into a country, into a force to be reckoned with. And so most of the writers of the period were also aware of this kind of expansionism, so to speak, which was rampant in the United States in these years. And then step by step, when we get closer and closer to 1914, most of the writers of this period are either dead or they have already stopped writing, which is like a sign that a new age is actually on the horizon. So most of the writers, like for example, Mark Twain dies in 1910. And then, as I said, even with the beginning of the 20th century, uh, modernist writers seem to take center stage, and so they get all of the attention that other writers used to get in the previous ages. And so, as I've written here for you, we have so many different and we have so many fantastic writers who usher in a new age for American literature, which is best characterized by the term modernism. So, in the next couple of weeks, we are going to read some sample works by prominent writers of the late 19th century. And once that is over, we will begin talking about modernism in American literature, and we will start talking about all of those fantastic writers who lived between the First and the Second World Wars. And this brings the second part of the video to a conclusion. And I hope that you've had a great time listening to me. I hope I didn't bore you to death by talking about all of these issues, which was, of course, necessary for our course because we had to talk about all of these different trends in the literature of the period, both realism and naturalism. So thank you very much for watching the second video. Please read the works that I will upload for you. These are representative works from the literature of this period, 1865 to 1914. And then, as I said, when we finish those works, we will start talking about modernism. And when that is over, we will talk about contemporary American literature. So once again, thank you very much for watching the video. Have a good day and bye-bye.